Hello, everyone. Welcome. You just missed a fascinating conversation about Mexican food, which I'm sure we'll share at some point later on. I am this week, because I seem to be changing identity every webinar. I am now Trevor, Toby, and myself. And that's really only for certification purposes. But I'm Nick Dennis. Welcome once again to the webinar series, West African History Before the 1600s, with Professor Trevor Getz, Dr. Toby Green, and special guest star today, Tony Yeboah, who is a graduate student at Yale, who's come to join us, which we're really, really pleased about. Now, for those of you who are chronologically aware, the Asante Empire doesn't actually fit into the time frame that we've been talking about in the webinar series. But like Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, which Trevor mentioned to me before, he always goes off on tangents. And this is slightly a tangent, but related to the previous webinars. So we've got a lot of really interesting stuff to go through. So we're going to go through the usual kind of format. So Toby will go first, then we'll do some questions. Trevor will go next, and then we'll hand over to Toby. We'll do some questions then. Then after Tony, then we'll go back to Trevor, and then we'll try and wrap up with some questions at the end. The next webinar, which will be on Benin, is on the 26th of May. And we hope to have a special guest star, again, if we can arrange it, possibly, for that webinar as well. But we'll try and send you some more information. So without further ado, I'm going to turn my camera off and make sure this can all work and hand over to Toby. Okay, Toby, are you getting the presentation ready? Now I can't seem to hear you, Toby, at all. Hold on, let me. Good old technology. Hurrah, we've got your screen, Toby, but I'm not sure your mic is working. It says it's working, but I can't seem to hear you. Okay, hang fire, everyone.
This had to happen at least once, right?
Yeah, exactly. It had to happen at least once. I'd say while we're waiting for that, I have got a very quick poll that I'd like us to do. So I'm just going to put this up. So please select I'll give it a minute or two, or a minute or so.
Okay.
Oh, brilliant, Toby. Okay, we're just finishing off a poll. So I'm going to give you everyone about another 10 seconds.
Fantastic.
Also, while we're waiting. Okay, right. So just very quickly, the question was, have you taught or mentioned the Asante before in your teaching? 13% at Key Stage 3, 5% across Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4, Key Stage 5. No one really at Key Stage 5, and very small minority at Key Stage 4, which is really interesting. We'll come back to that a bit later. So I'm going to be quiet and hand over to Toby so you can share your screen.
Fantastic. Okay, so let me. Everybody can hear me, I hope, and I'm going to. Good. That's a start. Can everybody see my screen? No.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Let me see about sharing screen. Here we go. Show my screen. There we go. Now you can see my screen. Okay, everybody. I'm sorry about those glitches, but here we are. So that's the main thing. And thank you very much to Nick for holding the fort with the poll, as I gather. So, okay, I'm going to give you an introduction as best I can to Asante. I'm not primarily a historian of Asante. You'll be in much better hands actually with Tony and Trev, I think, when it comes to a lot of the real detail. But what I can do is give you an overview of Asante and try and place that in some contexts, and just as I have done in the previous couple of sessions, really, some ways in to thinking about interesting themes, things which will help to develop interesting classes, which then Tony and Trev are going to give you the real pointers as to how to embed that in the classroom. But this will be a way to get into thinking about the topic. So hopefully that's going to be good. So I'm going to talk just finally also to say I'm probably going to speak for until around about 6:30 more or less, and then hopefully there'll be some time to answer some questions as and when they come in, if there are any. So this is just an overview of what we're going to look at. We're going to start with the background, as we often do, and just some interesting snippets to start with to get you thinking of ways in which this will be relevant and connect to lots of things which you already know about and some of the themes we've talked about in previous sessions. And you begin to make some of those connections, which I think hopefully will be helpful. And then go into an outline of Asante history. Then we'll look at key context, which is sort of one of the things I often do. Themes which you can pick out with your students, which will make this a really interesting and relevant history for them. Resources for teaching Asante history, such as they are, and open some web pages to look at that, and then finally look at more resources, a short bibliography at the end. And the first thing, as Nick said, we're moving a bit forward in time to the previous sessions. We're looking at essentially the 18th and 19th centuries when we look at Asante, and that's of interest in terms of how West African societies and large West African polities really evolved in the pre-colonial era. Asante was certainly one of the most powerful kingdoms in West Africa by the 18th century, and certainly more powerful actually. If you were to compare it to Songhay and Mali, which we looked at last time, Songhay, as I mentioned, fell in 1591, and really in the 17th century into the 18th century, that region of the Sahel and the Niger Bend, there was no large power which rose there. The main powers which did rise in West African societies tended to rise in this era nearer to the coast, Asante being one, Oyo in what's now Nigeria, Dahomey in Benin. And that's also, of course, symptomatic of changing geopolitical frameworks, access to coastal trade becoming more relatively important, comparatively important, perhaps I should say, than the trans-Saharan trade had been in previous centuries. So Asante speaks to that. Now this is a map of Asante Achem. Its capital was Kumasi, second city in Ghana today, located, well, it's around about, I think, about 150 miles north of the coast at Cape Coast and Elmina, and it's north also of the band of hills which rise between Asante and the coast, and that geographical factor is quite important. Also, that these were some of the major gold mining areas for a long time, long prior to Asante, in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. These were some of the key gold seams whose gold eventually made its way to North Africa. And this map is also interesting. If you look to the right-hand side, towards the top, you'll see Dagombe, Eastern Gonja, and then it will say, and then the arrows which say to Hausaland, and that was a very old trading route. That was the way in which much of the gold actually went from the gold fields south of what became Asante to the trading markets in what's now northern Nigeria, Kano, and then across the Sahara. So these are very old trading routes, which Asante then came to power in the early 18th century and took charge of. Gonja, just finally to mention, Gonja, also very important historically as a region in this part of Ghana, and actually dating to the 15th and 16th centuries. You find it in sources there. So when we come to Asante, one of the things, as we saw last time, we looked at aspects of cultural life, architecture, and music, in that case in Mali, which are fascinating ways of bringing this to life in the classroom. And I think in the case of Asante, there are similarly many fascinating ways to bring this to life. And one is particularly actually in material culture. Now here we have an Asante gold weight. So Asante is known often as the Kingdom of Gold. As I've mentioned, it was the area, it was one of the centers of the gold trade in West Africa. And these gold weights, you see an example here. I think the best way I can describe the importance of these gold weights is to mention a book written by a collector called Tom Phillips, published a few years ago. And in this book, Phillips estimates that over the course of his collecting life, he has handled over 1 million gold weights. And I think that is testament to the enormous artistry of the people of Asante, and also to the importance of gold, of markets, and of course of the things which the rates represent. And as well, I've just got a few examples here, and I know Trev is going to talk in a lot more detail about these, but just as a way into seeing that the visual sources you can use to put together your resources are really extraordinary for Asante. So here is an equestrian statue from Asante, which speaks to the importance of horses, of course, and again speaks to provenance of those horses, trade, and also access to saddles and all of the leather workers and all the kinds of things that were necessary to make horsemanship an important part of Asante life. Representations of natural history. Here's a scorpion. Of warfare. Here's a gold weight of a sword. And here's a very interesting and important symbolic one. So you have material culture, warfare, natural history representing the gold weights. You also have symbolic worldviews. This is a Sankofa. I'll just slip down to this. Now, the Sankofa represents a bird which has its head turned backwards and its feet facing forwards. It's often associated with the proverb. I'm not going to try my tree on you because my tree is very basic, so I will simply say it's not wrong to go back for that which you've forgotten. And this speaks to something which Trev, I know, is going to talk about as well, which is the value of proverbs in teaching Asante history. And I think that this example of the Sankofa and the various gold weights we've just looked at very briefly, I think are important because they show that by using material culture as sources, we can begin to see how the gold weights speak to the economy. They speak to material culture, artistry, craftsmanship, and the different associated trades, leather workers and so on, who might work the saddles and so on. And they also, of course, speak to worldviews and philosophies, which come up very clearly in the Proverbs. And so there is a whole range of sources which we can use, just starting from these gold weights, to begin to really help students in the classroom to make this world come alive for them, to help them to imagine it. And I think that's really great. You know, that's a great way of bringing this to young people. Just beyond the gold weights, and the Proverbs, you've of course got Kente cloth, and cloth, the huge variety of cloth and Kente cloth that you find, which was produced and is still produced is full of symbolic meanings, which everyone knows is going to talk about in more detail later. So that's just a way into thinking about how material culture, proverbs, and the many different resources that there are to help bring that together and make it visually appealing to students can really help to those students to imagine and find their way into this. Okay, So we're now going to have a brief overview of Asante history. And first thing to say is Asante is not the first major kingdom in what's now Ghana. They have many precursors, particularly Bono Mansu, which was the major gold-producing region, as I said, which traded eventually through the trans-Saharan trade and to other parts of the West African region. And that grew from around the 12th century. And some of its centers, Bego, for example, you find that mentioned in Arabic documents from the 15th and 16th centuries. So this is a very ancient and important area. And those documents which mention it come from Gonja in what's now northern Ghana, but also further afield in what was the Empire of Mali. So that speaks a little bit to its interconnections. In the sources we have, the written sources we have for the 17th century in particular, it's particularly Akwamu and Nchira, which are the major kingdoms in this region. They both rise in the 17th century. They're both major trading partners of Europeans and really control aspects of the gold trade. And I think the very interesting thing about Asante and about what modern Ghana in general in the pre-colonial era is that this is not an area where the slave trade was at all important until around the early 18th century. It only actually really began in earnest in the late 17th century. Until that time, the gold trade was much more important, and also textiles. So those are interesting features of pre-Asante history in this part of West Africa. Got a lot of detail here, and I won't perhaps read it all out, but hopefully you'll have a bit of time now just to look over it yourself. And what you'll see is that Asante rises in around 1700 in response to struggle against Nchira. And you'll see also the symbolic importance of gold. The second point mentions the golden stool, which is effectively the throne of the Asantehines, the rulers of Asante, and the very important concept in Twi, the language of Asante and of most of Ghana today, the sunsum, or the spirit or soul of the Asante people, which is something which is very important in very many different aspects actually of Asante, but of Twi, but was important at that time. In the early 18th century, Asante becomes more powerful, extends its borders, as you see towards the bottom of that slide, and then develops the state structures. And this is an interesting feature. We'll come to that in a bit more detail in a moment, with levies to build roads. And in fact, the main road from Kumasi to Cape Coast today is the old military road, which was built by the Asante, and gradually building a state bureaucracy and appointing officials from around what was becoming a more powerful and more expansive state by the later 18th century. Moving into the 19th century, so the 18th century is a time of expansion. It's a time of Asante is bringing in gold from tributary states, as well as mining its own gold in the areas it controls, and there are two currencies. There's the gold, which is in circulation in Asante, and then cowries, which are traded with the neighboring states which use cowries. In the 19th century, Asante begins a further cycle of warfare, wars at the coast against the Fanti, and more interaction with the British. So the British, the first British visitor is Thomas Bowditch, who comes in 1817. And wrote a famous book about it. It was a book which, for example, inspired the Bronte family, actually, in many of the imaginary games, which became very important to their novels in the 19th century. Then the British attacked Kumasi in 1823, were defeated. There were various peace treaties, and then the Anglo-Ashanti Wars, which became very important in the second half of the 19th century, and eventually Asante refused to become a British protectorate in 1895, and was incorporated into the Gold Coast colony. But while that British aspect of the advance of colonial power is fundamental, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that actually in the 19th century, Asante is not only interested in expanding and trading with the coast, but actually one of its main trading routes remains the trade to northern Nigeria, to Kano, and actually a cola nut trade, which was the cola nuts, which were fundamental to many aspects of West African life. They're fundamental in role in terms of gift giving, celebrating weddings, in all kinds of human interactions and social interactions. And also some have argued were important in northern Nigeria because they're also a stimulant. So in the Islamic world, northern Nigeria, that was one of their appeals, according to Paul Lovejoy, who's done the most significant piece of research on this. So that was Asante in the 18th and 19th century. That's an overview. We're now going to move on to some of the contexts. And the first is, not very surprisingly, gold. This is a photograph I took at Manjaa Palace Museum in Kumasi 2 or 3 years ago. And it's not the original palace. The original palace was burned to the ground by the British, and this one was built in its place. I think it was 1924, but Tony will correct me when he speaks, I'm sure. And if you go into the palace, the first thing you were told is Asante is the kingdom of gold. And gold was fundamental to daily life. We've already talked about that in the huge number of gold weights which were produced for daily transactions. It was the major trade of the Gold Coast, as I've said, until 1700, and before that, before the 15th century, in the connecting Asante to the Sahel and across the Sahara. And gold dust was the main currency of Asante after 1700, and as I mentioned, cowries were used to trade with neighbours. And there were huge numbers of craftsmen who produced various objects which were symbolic of royal authority, and there were many of these. There were masks such as this, the property of an Asantehene, and there was the golden stool, which, as I've mentioned, was the throne. And there are some good resources to see there. So this was a series of articles you'll find at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Here's one. This is Gold in Asante Courtly Arts, which, as you'll see, has some fine images and also some interesting essays there. So that's a good resource to find more out about that. So clearly, gold has economic power and symbolic power. And interestingly, if we were to compare that for a moment, step back to something which may be more familiar to many of you, to Europe in this period, if you think of Spain and Portugal, which were also importing huge amounts of gold, the same was also the case there. Of course, they were very economically dependent on gold, but also gold was melted down and put into the altarpieces that were put up in the churches of Iberia in the 16th and 17th centuries. So that's an interesting comparison. Second important context, state structures. State power was important in Asante, as it is in all states, of course, but I think it's also important to recognize that what was going on in Asante was comparable and analogous to what was happening in many states around the world at this time, which shows just how far West Africa was integrated into global structures. Western historians would call Asante, well, they wouldn't usually actually, but I would certainly say they should call Asante a fiscal military state. And what they mean by that is a state that grew in this period, the early modern period, developing its tax base, as Asante did, and through that tax base, funding its expanding bureaucracy, its treasury, and its army. And that was fundamental to Asante. And warfare, that fundamental aspect of the fiscal military state, was essential to the very concept of Asante. It's not that Asante represented people who hadn't lived in this region before. They hadn't migrated to Asante. They were Akan people who formed together in Kumasi because of war, Asante for, as Chui describes it. And this is very symbolic, I think, of the growing importance of warfare to state structures, not only in West Africa, but also in Europe by the late 17th century. And with that rising state, you had a very complex bureaucracy, an imperial bureaucracy with departments looking at aspects of taxation, foreign affairs, law, and so on. There was a National Assembly, the Asante Manjaamu, which had 200 elders who dealt with government business, resolved disputes, an inner council, and much of the bureaucracy was run by the Asante Hama, the Queen Mother, who also nominated the successor of the Asante Hene. And actually, this is an interesting aspect of a number of kingdoms in West Africa at this time, that the power of the Queen Mother in many kingdoms was fundamental, and actually often the bureaucracies and were run by them and by other women in the state compound. So that's an important aspect of gender relations. And complex systems of taxation, a treasury, foreign affairs department. So this aspect, I think, is very important and is interesting to bring out. Asante sits between the Atlantic and the Sahara, as I've mentioned. So there's some examples of this. When the British captured Kumasi in 1874, at Manjaa Palace, they found a large library, had books in many languages, including Arabic, Dutch, and French. Bowditch writes that in his book about his visit in 1817. And this is symbolic of Asante's position between the two trade routes. Architecture does show some Islamic influences, but is resolutely Asante. And so this concept of being between two trading systems is very important. These are the cola nuts, which I've mentioned before, which were very important in that trade to Kano in the 19th century. Kano by that time had become the most important city in the Caliphate of Sokoto, which was the largest state in West Africa by this time in northern Nigeria, had a large cloth producing industry, particularly indigo dyed cloth, which was traded in return for cola, and also with the cowries, which was a common currency between the two by the 19th century. And then what I've put here is global Asante. So Asante has an important role in the New World. Kwasi Konadu has particularly written about the role of the Akan diaspora, the people of what's now Ghana in the New World. They formed marine communities in Jamaica, they're known as the Cormantin, who became very important in many of the major slave results in Jamaica in the New World, especially Taki's War. So there's a new book by the Harvard Professor Vincent Brown about that, which might be interesting to look at. And their gold mining skills were actually very important in Brazil. So the historian in northeastern Brazil, Carlos da Silva Jr., has done some interesting work recently showing that although it's not been written about much, in fact, there was a demand for people from this part of Ghana, Asante, in the 18th century. And there's a significant trade from the Gold Coast to the gold mines of Brazil. And I'm sorry about the phone, which will ring off in a moment. And finally, cloth. I'll just wait for it to stop. So cloth was prized in the New World, and in fact, there's some interesting documents which talk about in Brazil about Akan-speaking troops who specially asked for cloth to be sent from the Gold Coast region to Brazil. So there's lots of ways in which aspects of Asante culture and Asante technology in terms of gold mining and Asante military practices in terms of the slave revolts in the New World were very important. So just to conclude, as we're nearly at 6:30, I think if we have a think about the things I've talked about in the last 25 minutes or so, in terms of gold and the economy, arts and architecture, state infrastructure, and the way that that's developed in the 18th century, and the transnational relationships, both with the Arab world and as far afield as the Americas. I think all of that, when we bring it together, is really illuminating in how many ways Asante can unpick the stereotypes which still persist in some quarters about Africa. And because we have an expanding state infrastructure funded in just the same way as state infrastructures which were growing in Europe in the 18th century were growing. We have transnational relationships, and we have this amazing history of craftsmanship, symbolic representation in gold, and the beauty that that offers visually for students to really get their teeth into. So there's so many reasons why teaching Asante is a great thing to do. Here are some resources which you can have a look at in your own time. as I said, the Metropolitan Museum has a couple of really interesting articles about that. The Ghana Web Resources Ghanaian government page about Ashanti history, and so those hopefully will be useful. And finally, just a few bits of suggested reading. The first by Aluwahen, one of the foundational historians of modern Ghana, and that's a primary source you can get hold of by one of the Asante Heenies, the history of Ashanti kings and the whole country itself. Kwasi Konadu's book on the Akan diaspora, and then two quite classic books about pre-colonial Asante by T.C. McCaskey and Ivor Wilkes. So I'm going to leave it there, and I've managed to keep to time. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry, I apologise again for the problems at the beginning. Okay.
No, that's not your fault. Thank you, Toby. I mean, there are two really important things that, from my point of view, I know my grandmother will be really, really pleased because she's from Jamaica, and I remember her telling me stories about the Maroons. So you know that's one of the interesting things I'll talk to her about. But I found there's a really interesting comparison when you're talking about the formation of Asante in the 1700s, and it just pinged into my head about the Treaty of Westphalia and the rise of the sovereign states in Europe. And I thought, well, that would be a really interesting comparison to make there as a way of, you know, linking globally the rise of the states. So I think there's some fantastic things there.
I just want to unplug this phone.
Yeah, that's fine. We've got one question from Estelle. And Estelle, I'll wait for Toby to come back.
Yeah, here I am. I'm back.
Okay, brilliant. Right, it's quite a long one, but essentially, Estelle has asked, based on Jutta Wimler's book, where it suggests that the Asante was not involved in the slave trade as much as Benin. Could you maybe explain? I know we're talking about Benin in a few weeks' time. The differing relations between Benin and Asante with the European traders.
Well, I mean, I think I would rather say, I mean, this isn't a direct answer to the question, but I would rather say there are so many things to talk about with Asante, and I think it would be nice to get out of a box of to teaching about in relation to the slave trade first. I think there are so many ways of making this a relevant topic. I think, well, Cape Coast, to answer the question though, Cape Coast was one of the major slave trading ports in the 18th century, as was Elmina on this part of Africa. Well, they weren't as big. Having said that, they were not as big as Ouidah. Ouidah was by far the biggest in Dahomey. Benin was never a major slave trading state. It was a slave trading state in the 18th century, but in comparative terms, it was not at the extent, I would say, of Asante, but much less of Dahomey. That's my view, but maybe Trevor and Tony have a different view. I don't know, but that's how I would see it.
Yeah, I was wondering if I can just weigh in on this. You know, I mean, it's a hard question, and actually, I agree with Toby that we tend to sometimes focus on the slave trade as the major topic for these regions, and that does them a bit of a disservice. So Asante has these long relationships, especially with Elmina, and Asante merchants have these long relationships, especially down to the coast to Kita and Ada, to these Ewe-speaking communities as well, that were, you know, somewhat significant between 1670 and about 1790 or 1800 within the slave trade. And there were, you know, people who were especially taken as tribute from the far north of Asante, or in war, in conflict, and sold along the coast. But it's also true that this is a region that during much of this period has a labor shortage, especially for gold production, which needs large amounts of labor in this period. And also, especially in terms of, we'll talk about this, wanting to expand the matrilineage in size. And so it is somewhat more limited than what is called the slave coast in some ways in terms of numbers and such. But Asante clearly is participating on a state level in the slave trade. The Santahenes themselves have an interest in it. And so one can't kind of put it entirely to the side.
But would you agree, Trev, that in a way the slave trade, I mean, it'd be wrong to call it for the Asantehene, it's almost like a byproduct. It's not their main interest. Their main interest is not the slave trade. Their interest is expanding state power, as you say, expanding the matrilineage.
Yeah.
And then if there is a population of war captives, as Britain, for example, expelled its convicts to Australia, they will expel them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's right, and I would say that the cola trade remains, really much more important in many ways, right? The cola trade is sort of vital to the state economy of Asante throughout this period. Gold, as we'll see, and as you talked about, is very important, and so it's not sort of a central operation, but also not entirely absent.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, great, and I'm sure we'll pick up some of these things. So I hope, Estelle, that's managed to address your question, which is be more expansive, but also there's lots of nuances that we need to consider. Okay, great. I'm going to switch over to Trevor. So he has the power now.
Great, thank you. Okay. And hopefully you're all seeing my presentation right now, and I'll be told if you're not. And of course,
I can see your folder, but not the presentation.
Oh, I shared the wrong thing. I apologize. Hang on one second. Yes, there's also a folder called Asante. And now the presentation is up, right?
It is, yeah.
All right, and can you see my face, or have I disappeared?
No, I can see your face as well.
All right, good. And folks, I have a regular strength allergies, not COVID-19. So excuse my sniffing, if you will. So Toby's given us this great introduction, I think, and Tony and I are going to take it from here to look at some really. I'll start with a few maps that might be useful in the classroom, but then we're going to be looking at oral and figurative and physical sources. And I'll just say that Tony is fast becoming the world expert in Asante architectural history. It's the topic of his PhD at Yale, but also work that he did as a master's student at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. And so he's going to be showing us some stuff that doesn't get talked about a lot, which is fantastic. But I'm going to start with some different sources, and I'm going to end by looking at gold a little bit more than Toby had time to do. But let's start with some maps, because maps are always useful in the classroom, and they can help to explain the complexity. And the thing is that I know in the classroom we want to kind of reduce the complexity so that our students can understand things in simple terms. But at the same time, we want to give them a bit of the richness of how complex some of these states and societies were in their social organization. So here is a map showing essentially the dominant ethnic groups, or purporting to show the dominant ethnic groups in Ghana today. These are really linguistic groups. So ethnicity, it's kind of a stand-in for ethnicity, but it's not perfect for us. And we're looking at that big red linguistic group in particular, or red-brown, who are labeled ethnically as the Akan people, although again, that's a bit of a reduction. And within the Akan languages, which are generally labeled the Twi languages, although Twi is also one version, is Asante Twi, which is the language that's spoken in Asante and many of its former provinces. There are also other versions of Twi, such as Fanti, and also, well, there are several versions of Twi from the coast to the interior. And so if you're talking about ethnicity, you can kind of start in that way. But it's important to note that Asante, although Akan at its core, was a multi-ethnic state. It wasn't a tribe. It wasn't a state that was an ethnicity necessarily. It occupied a lot of territory. Some people who spoke Asante Twi were members of sort of the core states at the middle, others lived in the exterior, and you know, some Akan, some Twi speakers may have been considered subjects of the crown, sort of, you know, conquered subjects of the crown, whereas some people who spoke as their primary languages some of these languages of the north, the Mole Dagbani languages and such, may have been considered essentially citizens. So it gets pretty complex here, but that complexity is part of the richness of our ability to see this as a state, rather than trying to reduce it to sort of an ethnicity or a tribe per se. The Asante themselves, however, are essentially, by and large, Akan, if you will. And the history of the Akan is somewhat debated, but what we can say is that Akan speakers generally seem to have migrated southward from the Savannah zone. And that West African Savannah was a place of great innovation in the medieval period. We already know that, looking at Mali and Songhay and such. And so groups of people who are the progenitors, the forefathers rather, of the Akan seem to have moved from the edge of the savannah there, especially through a place called Kintampo, which in oral tradition at least is remembered as the place where this migration started, southward through Asante and further to the south to create these many different states, these many different Akan-dominated states. But we now argue that along the way, they meet lots of local people who spoke probably languages related to modern-day Guan or Etsi, which are very minority languages, and intermingled with them. And so modern Akanness is a result of this mix of people moving from the savannah and bringing technologies with them, and then mixing with people who are already living in these areas. I included this map from 1729 just because, although it's a European map and it's not, you know, accurate to GPS standards, it shows that Asante, which here is spelled Assiante, was one of a large number of states in this region, a large number of states. And these states then created like a state system, much like you would imagine seeing in Europe at this time. And lots of these states were Akan-speaking states, Dinchira, Achem, which is spelled A-K-I-M there. But your students can get a sense then that this was a place with a system of states, but that Asante emerges as the dominant state really in the 18th century. And so Toby shared a similar map to this one, which shows then the rise of Asante superimposed on the outline of modern-day Ghana. Some might push this map a little bit further, in fact, and push those boundaries a little bit further. But what's important here is that Asante begins as a confederacy. We talked about this for those of you who are here to talk about Congo. It begins as a confederacy of a number of states that come together to overthrow the power of a neighboring state, Dinchira. And then over time, they become so strong that they begin to push out their authority. So if you look at that green region, you can say, well, what is that green region? Is it part of the Asante state ruled by the crown? Well, large areas of it were. Are those tributary states that just have to pay tax or tribute? To some degree, some of them were that as well. Some of those towns on the coast, like Elmina actually is Dutch. You know, in many ways, the Dutch come in there. The Dutch agree to pay rent to Asante or pay a tribute to Asante as long as they're there, really until 1870 or 1868, when the Dutch leave and the British take over Elmina. You know, everybody is either paying rent or tribute or is part of the Asante state in sort of a patchwork, at the center of which is this very strong confederation. So that's important to understand, I think. And then the final map here is a map showing Ghana's acquisition, Britain's acquisition of what becomes Ghana over time, beginning with the Gold Coast colony in 1874, never formally conquered, never formally becomes part of Britain by treaty, by the way. It just sort of happens, and that's very interesting. Asante refuses to become a protectorate, but is finally conquered in a war in 1901 to 1902. And much of the story of the 19th century, as Toby put it out there for Asante, is a story of the conflict between Britain and Asante to be the big power in this region. And it's a conflict in which the Asante sometimes win, but ultimately lose. But if you help students see this as sort of two superpowers in the region, if you will, one being Britain, the other being Asante, and for many local people, then sort of see them equally as something that they have to sort of choose between or ally with, etc. Then you get probably a truer picture of what was going on. So those are just some maps. Before I get into sources, I just want to also talk a little bit about three institutions that Toby talked about that are important for students to understand. And the first one is the Abuswa, which is singular, and Abuswa, which is the extended family based on matrilineal lines. Toby talked about the importance of queen mothers to the state. This is partly because matrilineage for the Akan is the way in which family is formed. The Abuswa, by the way, probably form, these big extended matriclans, probably form when people move from the savannah into the forest and they need lots of labor to clear the forest, to cut things down. But they only need lots of labor every 7 or 8 years because the forest doesn't need to be cleared really every year. And so having extended families to help you out in the years when you're clearing a new area is very helpful. But these matriclans become very important. We're going to see that in all our sources. There's also the institution of the Aberempon, or plural Oberempon. These are generally seen as entrepreneurial people. On the coast, among the coastal Akan people like the Fanti, they generally become essentially very much merchants. They're very much Atlantic merchants. In Asante, the Aberempon play more of a role as sort of a wealthy nobility in some ways, less sort of centrally involved in kind of Atlantic trading, as it were. And the third one being the chief or the king, then plural, the Henfo. So you'll hear when you read about kings and chiefs in this region, there are lots of people whose name ends in sort of, or title ends in H-E-N-E. The most important being the Asante king, the Asantehene. This is then a suffix that shows that someone is part of the chiefly class. And so chiefs and kings arise from royal Abuswa, royal families, who are related to each other in many cases between the states, but also different. And by the way, there is no elder son right to the throne. When a chief or king dies, there's a selection process. Often the queen mother plays a role in it. So do the heads of families and such. So we're going to see the power of kings and chiefs actually is limited in various ways by various institutions. So those are some maps and those are some institutions. And I've got notes on here, as you'll see, if you want to take any of these into the classroom. And now let's get at some of our sources. And I'm hoping that these sources will be really interesting to analyze with students in the classroom to try to pull meaning out of them. And I'm going to start with oral sources with Proverbs. And I'll give you a warning and you can decide how much you want to share it with students. But many of these Proverbs, we don't know when they arose. We don't know precisely where they arose. And Proverbs are interesting because on the one hand, commonly said Proverbs tell us this is a value in society. On the other hand, you wouldn't need a proverb if people didn't, contravene the rules sometimes. So the proverb doesn't mean everybody actually acts this way, but it is advice, a culturally held sense of advice on how you should act. I'm pulling my Proverbs from Ivor Ajimandua, Kwame Anthony Appiah, and Peggy Appiah's Bumebe. Proverbs of the Akan. It's 7,000 proverbs. It's organized alphabetically in Asante or in Twi, and so it's hard to go through sometimes and pull out proverbs unless you know some terminology in Twi. But it's a fantastic, it's an incredible resource of proverbs that Peggy Appiah mostly gathered over her life. So here are 4 proverbs that I picked out, right? So the first one deals with the Abuswa, and I think gives a good sense of the importance of the Abuswa. And there are actually 2 proverbs there. The first is, the Abuswa does not say, take your things and go. All members belong together. So you can't really be kicked out of your Abuswa. Or rather, an Abuswa shouldn't kick people out. Actually, people can be kicked out, and normally then they become dependent, or they wanderers, or they end up enslaved or something like that, but it's very rare. Similarly, the tree of the Abuswa, we do not cut it. So, and hey, Tony, if you feel like jumping in on any of these, you can feel free to contradict or expand what I'm saying. But so there's the importance of the Abuswa. As a historian, I always like to throw in the bit about he who knows the history of the country becomes a judge of it. There are professional historians in Asante and broader Akan society. They are people who know history. They are people who often serve the king or chief. They're linguists, so they speak for them. They place themselves in between supplicants and the king and the chief and advise them, this sort of thing. So the third one is advice for chiefs or kings, right? The chief who cannot be advised is the one who is dropped in the dirt from his palanquin, right? So the people who were carrying him, they warned him, hey, you know, there's something coming up, but the chief wasn't interested, and so they trip and he's dropped. Or similarly, a chief before whom we are afraid to express an opinion is the one who eats the vulture and thinks it is a chicken. Vultures don't taste good, but somebody might serve a king a vulture, and the people might warn him, hey, that's not a chicken, it's a vulture. But if they're afraid to warn him, then he will end up eating vulture, which apparently is not nice. So there then certainly is advice for chiefs and kings. And the final proverb that I have here is, the chief's taboo is argument, the royals is discrimination, and the servants is the revealing of origin. So taboo means something you're not supposed to do. So chiefs don't argue, right? Chiefs are supposed to sit and be judges. People argue before them and make debates, but the chief himself doesn't intervene in argument. He's not there to make a case. So that's interesting. The royal family, their taboo is discrimination. They're supposed to treat everybody equally, right, as part of the community. And the servant, okay, so akoa is not a word for slave, it's a word for servant, but there is some sort of overlap there. And the servant is then somebody who came from somewhere. Maybe they were from an Abuswa somewhere, they were cut loose. Maybe they were captured in a war. They're not supposed to talk about where they were before. They're here now. So you can see their sort of values about how different people in society at different levels are supposed to act. So those are some of my favorite proverbs. As I said, in Buma Bay, there are 7,000 proverbs. An interesting project might be to let students loose on proverbs. They all have the Twi, a transliteration, English transliteration, and some of them have short explanations. But asking students to try to make meaning of them can be an interesting way to go, especially if you frame it in asking them specifically to try to figure out certain things, like what is marriage like and what are values about marriage, for example. You can choose, there are so many. Adinkra is a second form of evidence that's really interesting. This is its symbology, right? These are symbols whose meaning is often tied to proverbs. Toby showed Sankofa, go back and get it, which again has been strongly adopted by the African American community in particular, about the possibility of going back to Ghana, especially on pilgrimage. But there are a number, and it's arguable about where they really come from and how long they've been around, but we've certainly found some that go back to the early 19th century at the least. So here's my favorite, frankly, Fihankra. I want you to take a look at the shape of this. This is the extended family compound, and Tony's going to talk to us about architecture. It's certainly a message about family unity and the importance of the Abuswa, but physically also it mimics the way that compound houses are sort of set up, with the house around a compound and patios in the middle. So there, I think we have an important message. This is the most widely used, actually, Jinyame, or accept God. The first 3 years I was working in Ghana, I thought it was accept God, and it was telling you to accept God. In fact, it's a bit more complex. It comes probably from a proverb that tells us that no one saw the beginning of all creation, and no one will see the end, except God. So it shows the power of God, certainly, but also your humility before God. You need to really be quite humble before God, because you're not seeing the beginning of creation or the end. Only God is. Now you may ask, is a monotheistic God? Was it an Asante or Akan belief prior to the arrival of Europeans and Christianity, or prior to the arrival of Muslims who really arrive in Kumasi first across the Sahara? And the answer does seem to be that although there are all kinds of gods and spirits and such in Akan cosmology, certainly there is a sort of all father figure, a sort of supreme deity figure, going back at least as far as we can see. So it does predate the arrival of both Islam and Christianity, we think. Hard to tell. A final one that I've always found fun, if your hands are in the dish, and it comes from a proverb as well, saying, if your hands are in the dish, people do not eat everything and leave you nothing. This is much less sort of esoteric. It's basically an instruction to remind you to, take part. If you don't play, you can't win, right? And so you must be part of life. You must be part of enterprises. You must, take risks, things like that, because otherwise, if you leave things up to fate and you don't act, if you don't take responsibility yourself, you'll get nothing. So there again is an Adinkra symbol that I particularly like. And while we're on this sort of symbology, I want to move to Kente, which is a form of Ghanaian cloth. It's interesting because Kente has now become, in many ways, especially in the US in some ways, a cloth indicating sort of African and African American unity, sort of Pan-Africanism. And the way that happened is interesting, actually. The first prime minister of independent Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, elevated this particular kind of cloth to the national cloth of Ghana at a time when people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were visiting Ghana. They both came to Ghana, and in addition, Nkrumah came to the United States. Of course, he studied in the United States as well, but once he was prime minister, he came to the United States. And so this cloth became really elevated. It probably started in Asante, although Ewe speakers in Ghana and Togo claim that they invented Kente cloth. It's woven in small squares on a smaller loom. It's very, very labor intensive. And so it's still very expensive. But again, the patterns are meaningful. And so if you think in sumptuary terms, if a person is wearing a pattern, they're expressing some idea for people to know. So here is a pattern that is frequently worn by chiefs, in fact. And it's a pattern that tells you that one person does not rule a nation. So you can ask students, I mean, so if somebody who is in power is wearing that cloth, what are they saying? What message are they trying to give? You know, how are they acknowledging themselves and the limits of their power? So there's one version. Here again, right, Abu Suayyadom, this is indicating the importance of the extended family. And so if somebody is wearing that, then they're acknowledging how important their extended family is as well. And for students, this can be just, you know, if you just gave students Proverbs and cloth and Adinkra and architecture and said how important is the extended family according to these sources, they would really get, I think, a sense of how important it is. Achampen, thousands of shields, the idea that unity, again, is important to defend the nation, again, a symbol of sort of the importance of the state and the unity of the people. Right. So architecture, Tony's going to take over in a second. Nick, do you want me to wait to answer any questions about my section until after I talk about gold, or are there questions waiting right now?
No, no questions right now, so we can head over to Toby and then we can talk about any questions that come up.
All right, and in order to facilitate things, I'm going to advance the slides when Tony tells me to, but he's going to come up now. So, Tony, you ready?
Ready.
All right.
Yeah.
So you want me to go to the next slide?
Not yet.
Okay.
I want to thank you, Trevor and Toby and Nick, for inviting me to be part of this session. I'm very grateful. Yeah. So, Trevor, I think we can move to the next slide. I want to begin by picking up on what Trevor and Toby, a comment they made 2 weeks ago about the fact that the architecture that we saw in the West African medieval empires at the time were influenced by the nature of the materials available, as well as the sociocultural practices of the people. And I think it was the same thing in Kumasi, and I believe like elsewhere across the globe. So the local cultures and the sociocultural practices influencing the nature of the built environment. So I am going to basically look at three main types of housing in Kumasi at this time. I'm going to look at what Trevor mentioned, the family compound house, and I'll look at the palace, and then I'll look at shrine or temple. So I will begin with this by saying that generally Kumasi's or Asante architecture consisted of single story type of housing that appeared in different kinds of expressions and designs depending on the world and status of the individual. So this is where, again, we go back to the ideograms, and so the wealthy household and the wealthy and most influential chiefs, it was easily to sort of see their houses whenever you were in a neighborhood because their houses were elaborately adorned. And mainly or traditionally the houses, all the houses consisted of a single, identical building plan. So here we're looking at a rectangular shape or rectangular type of housing where you have single block of houses that were closely connected to one another to create sort of a central courtyard at the center. So in this picture, we see at least those that are, we see two block of houses, the one directly facing us and the one to the right. And so we have single, at the opposite end of each of the block, we have another type of similar blocks. So they enclose each other to create that courtyard at the center. And the courtyard was very, very important to the social practices of the people. So in this image, I'm just going to begin with this image. I suspect that the people here had received, a guest, and the guest is the European that we see here. And chances are that all these people belong to the same family, the Busunya. So the idea is that you build to accommodate the whole members of the extended family. And so that space, the courtyard or eduho, was used for, observing several social practices, including serving as the living area of the household. This is where visitors are received, and this is where naming of a child was performed. So, and the whole point was that once you performed the naming ceremony, this is where officially you welcome the child into the household. And like in the opposite end, when somebody dies, you perform or you lay the person in state at the courtyard. And mostly it is done very close to another compartment within the household called a pato. And so once you do it there, symbolically, when a child is born, entrance, so accepting or welcoming a child into the house. And when someone dies, you perform it at the same end, so to signify sort of the exit point, so that the dead person is leaving the family into the ancestral world. Yeah, so basically this is create this rectangular pattern. So Trevor, please can we move to the next slide? Yes, I want to talk about the type of roofing in Kumasi or Asante. I'm sorry, I'm going to use Kumasi and Asante interchangeable. I'm so fixated on Kumasi, I don't know why. So we have two main types of roofing. We had the rectilinear roofing, and also we had a flat roofing. So the rectilinear roofing was steeply pitched, and so this was mainly used by sort of the wealthy household. Wealthy families, the chiefs or the sub-chiefs of the Asante. And then we also, and for the rectilinear type of roofing, the materials used for this was the palm fronds or grass. So this is where you have tiny sticks that were close, that were tied to a main timber frame. And then at the end, you have, you cover these tiny sticks with the palm fronds or maybe a grass. And then maybe to keep it in position, you may want to put maybe wood on it to keep it in a position for a while, and then later you can take it off. So this picture was taken in 1908, and it was a temporary market structure. So we don't really see from the structure on the left, we see that it's supposed to have been steeply pitched, but it's not clearly shown. And the one facing us on our right looks more like a flat type, but I still think it's supposed to have been the steeply pitched, but we don't see it clearly. So for the flat roofing, what they used mainly was the mud or the ram egg that was used as flat roofing. So if you can see a structure behind the market, this was a fort built by the British when they blown up the Asante Palace in 1874. Toby mentioned, the Manjaa Palace. Toby showed you the Manjaa Palace earlier. I wasn't really going to talk about it, but since we're here, so when Kumasi was burnt, the British at some point felt, that they needed to compensate the Asante people for burning the palace. So they built a palace, and that is what Toby showed in the other slide. Trevor, please can we move to the next slide? So at this point, I'm going to talk about the types of housing. So this is, I'm beginning with the Asante Palace. I have never seen any picture that shows the complete Asante Palace before 1874. All that we see is sort of sections of the palace, and this is an example of that. And so again, we see two individual blocks of houses that sort of closely to one another. And if you can see, there is a man in a white cloth. Behind him, the section behind him is called Pato, and this is where whenever there is the Asante is administering, cases between individuals, he sits at that section with his counsel, and that big space in front of the man is supposed to also be the eduho, the courtyard. But at the Asante or the National Palace, it is not called eduho. It is called Pramaso Kese. And it is only at the Asante Palace that the name changes. And again, giving us an idea of how sort of the Asante Palace is supposed to distinguish itself from the rest of buildings in the state. Please, can we move to the next slide, please? And this is an example of a family compound house. So this house is, I like this house because it shows us it gives us an example of how, you know, the different types of houses in Kumasi. Of course, I've said that they all had the same architectural layout, but depending on your status and depending on your wealth, your house could distinguish itself in a way. So I recently watched a documentary where we said that the Asante people dress to impress, and again they also build to impress. And so the people with, those Asante sub chiefs, they build this type of household. So if we look at the roofing sort of in the center, we could see that it is steeply pitched ahead of the other two on the left and right. And the platform below the roofing in the center is called dampon. And this is where it could be the leader or the family head, a bushapeni. This is where, whenever they had guests, visitors, this is where they had a meeting. You see that the platform opens onto the street, the public. So symbolically, whenever a leader or, a bushapeni receives a guest here and they're having conversation, they normally talk about issues that are not really sensitive so that people passing by could hear and it doesn't really bother them. I don't think you see the designs, the ideograms on this house. I'm not sure if this picture is clear, but I can see it. And so again, it's also giving us an idea that the ornamentation on the house, and it also gives an idea about the wealth of the family or the houses. And again, these type of houses were built along major streets. So the whole point was to sort of give the city a good appearance. And because Europeans traveling, and not just Europeans, and foreign traders traveling to Kumasi, they didn't have the time to sort of take a tour or move around, you know, the inner circles of the city. So once you have beautiful houses lined up along the major streets, you know, people go back and they give a good impression. It was, oh, Kumasi is beautiful because they're seeing all the beautiful houses. Yeah, Steph, please, can we move to the next slide? And finally, I am going to talk about the houses or housing for deities and the god. Asante believe in the worship of the gods, and the gods manifest themselves in places sometimes that seems unimaginable. They manifest themselves in rivers, they manifest themselves in trees. And so whenever people identify these signs, it's, oh, this is a god. So they build house for the god, and then there is a transactional relationship established from there. So when the people will provide housing for the god or the deity, and then in return, the god will also protect the people. And so this is, I'm showing you the compartment within the house. And this is one section. It is a part 2. It is a section where the drummers, therefore, this is where they performed, and directly opposite them we had the singers, and then so the whole point is, once the drummers and the singers closely opposite to one another, it ensures effective communication between the two and to know when to start a song or to end it. And they sometimes play the drum or the sing sort of to prepare the priest prophet to be possessed by the gods. Yeah, so please, can we move to the next slide, please? Yes, so this picture, I want to give an idea of how Kumasi looked in the 19th century. So this is an artist's impression of Kumasi. I recently found out that Kumasi, the leaders of Asante consciously prevented the practice of photography in Kumasi. So beginning in the somewhere 1860s, when photography, people started taking Europeans started taking photographs in the Gold Coast. Kumasi was sort of, I mean, mainly, I guess it was banned at the time because photographs taken in Kumasi prior to 1896 they were just too, compared to the Gold Coast or the southern states where several pictures had taken. I suspect that and the Asante leaders did this on purpose, sort of for security considerations and not to give an idea of how the city looked like. And I particularly, if you look at the background, we could see this spire-like tall roof. I don't know if you could see it clearly. And this is an example of the two photographs I showed about the dampong. So these were the houses, the most decorated houses that were lined up along major roads. So I suspect that the street looks to me like an avenue. At least we see two streets here. So I think it joins the main road there. And so these were where beautiful houses were situated. And this artist impression of sketch was taken on the roof of the Asante Palace. We could see the wall of the Asante Palace in 1874, just some few moments before it was blown up. And then I want to give you this the settlement pattern of Kumasi at this time. We could see that sort of the houses seems to be jumbled up, and this is what the Europeans didn't maybe understand. So they thought that the layout in Kumasi was not rationalized. It wasn't. It was irregular. But I think it was for security consideration and for easy communication between one household and the other. Yeah. So I think I'm going to end here and to say that Asante's architecture plays a very important role in the facilitation of the politics and the social lifestyles of Asante. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, no, that was great. I'm just thinking about inquiry questions here in my head about comparing social life and building of houses and the decorations and all kinds of things. I think there's some really good examples. So there's only two questions, and they're really directed at Trevor. But thank you for that. That was great. So honestly, there's some things I'm thinking about that we can do. But one was from Lewis, Trevor, and he's asking, did the Industrial Revolution and the increase of textile production in Europe have any effects on Asante cloth production and trade?
Yeah, and dramatically, as with everywhere else, and even before that, I mean, we can say that in this region, Indian cloth in the 18th century had become important, an important trade good, making its way into the interior, and so those cheap Indian cloth, and then the Dutch bringing Indonesian cloth, of course, things like batiks and such, and then of course once the Lancaster mills start producing. So what happens is that locally made cloth, and this is interesting, locally made cloth is more expensive and therefore is considered generally more elite. It's something that you bring out. So Tony, when do you wear when would one wear their Kente today? Would they wear it for everyday things or only for festivals?
Yeah, no, Kente, it's mostly for special occasions. These days, it has become popular with marriage ceremonies, and then also the Akweside and like festivals and other. It's because it's expensive, so it's for mainly important celebrations.
Yeah, it's really high status, whereas the cheap cloth flooding in from Liverpool and whatever was considered more everyday wear. It was immensely profitable, of course, to be involved in that trade for many people, but it was more sort of everyday. So yeah.
Okay, that's great. And a question for Tony, and this is from Ebenezer, and saying thank you for the presentation. And the question is, was the architecture very different for places where people were imprisoned? So if you were a criminal or you did something wrong, how different was it from the kinds of structures that we've looked at already?
Thank you. This is a great question, and this is something I've been thinking about. What I can say is that the layout, I have seen a prison and the premises of the Manjaa Palace. I have never entered. Getting access into the some spaces in Manjaa or the Asante Palace is really difficult. So it is something I've been thinking about, maybe doing a work or something on the prison in Asante, a pre-European prison in Asante. I have never seen how it looked like, but what I can say is that the layout is the same, like single block of houses connecting each other to create the center with rooms opening onto the courtyard. So I think that you might have the rooms in each block of housing like the regular family compound house. By this time, it will be converted to maybe prison cells or something like that. But I don't really know the conditions within this house, with these rooms.
Okay, now that's brilliant, and this is why it's so important that we can ask a world-leading expert these questions, get an answer, and saying, well, yeah, this is what we know at the moment, but there's always more to find out.
Yeah.
Brilliant. There was one other comment from Ebenezer as well, but I'll pass it on to Trevor later on. So, Trevor, if you want to go ahead.
All right. Well, let me just close things out by getting back to gold again, because it is so important. I want to start actually with a written source, a European just describing in the 19th century a wealthy Asante woman and what she was wearing. And I just want to note that gold more than anything was for ornamentation. I mean, it was expressive, it's meaningful, but the way we ornament ourselves is really important. And you get a sense here of a woman who has gold brooches, and you get a sense of Europeans being very interested in this. I mean, we should say that when in 1874 British troops made it to the Asante Palace in what turned out to be more a raid than a conquest, they financed the whole expedition by taking all of his gold. There was a lot of it. But here we have 4 brooches, gold buttons, manillas, that is to say, up the elbow, sort of circlets, chains, things to hold her cloth on, girdles, ankle and toe. This is a woman who was laden with gold. You had to display gold to show that you were important. Much like the French court in the previous century and such. But the thing about gold, of course, is it can be melted down. And part of the reason why we have so many gold weights and such is that it's not like for us, you buy a gold ring, it generally remains that gold ring for a long time. For wealthy Asante, it was constantly being refashioned. And so you would go to the goldsmith with some of your gold and say, this season, I think I would like it to look, I'd like some butterflies or whatever. And of course, the goldsmiths would constantly have to use these brass weights to weigh and record the amount of gold that you gave them, because you'd get that same amount back minus, whatever you were paying the goldsmith. And so goldsmiths were really, it was an ongoing thing to be a goldsmith, and a great goldsmith, a great artist was really well known. So here we have a toolbox from a gold merchant. The gold merchants had boxes. They would be bringing in gold dust that had been panned, sometimes nuggets that had been mined as well, and they would be weighing them and selling the gold and buying gold from miners. And so you see there in the middle a whole collection of weights. And so you had then the goldsmith and the gold merchant as the 2 sort of key figures in these transactions. And the weights themselves then become a very interesting piece of evidence. Now, just to be clear, I think most people know, but just to be clear, these weights are not made of gold. They're made of brass. They're there to weigh the gold. And most of them early on are probably coming in from the Sahel, from places like Mali, where the gold trade is, and many of the merchants are coming from Mali and Songhay and places like that, down to the coast with these weights. And these weights represent sort of common weights being used in North Africa as well in many cases. So early on, they're quite simple. This is from probably the 15th century. Then they get a little bit more complex and geometric. You might have to explain to your students that the swastikas have nothing to do with what they know swastikas have to do with. They're an earlier symbol. They're probably coming in from as far away as India as a symbol, so showing the connectedness of all of these trades through the Islamic world. There's certain standardizations to these bars that indicate the weight, but no single system. And so, you know, while we know that, for example, a swastika plus 2 bars generally meant 70.4 grams, sometimes it's not standardized and gets a little bit more complicated to know precisely what was going on. But it certainly demonstrates trade. And then, you know, as we get into the 18th century, we have these much more standardized high relief carved brass rates that are themselves this really incredible symbol of craftsmanship. Many of them then taking on, or some of them taking on Adinkra symbols. Some of them taking on patterns that we see in Kente. And so probably made more locally in this case, but becoming just more and more complex. And then later, although the weights remain relatively standardized, they begin to take on these forms that we then see that are so collectible and that make their way to places like museums in Europe later. And so many of them are animals. Some of the animals are not animals that are found in the region, in fact, which is very interesting, but most of them are. And also, of course, humans doing everyday human tasks. And so we see that also during the 18th century. And so I want to talk about a couple of these. I'm going to talk about ones that are actually in my local museum, the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco. So one very common animal. So again, what's interesting about these is that they also tie to proverbs in many cases. So here's the leopard. The leopard, it really is a symbol of skill. And for somebody to make a leopard weight would indicate that they are, you know, speaking of their own skill in part. But also there's this proverb that rain wets a leopard's skin, but does not wash out the spots. So, you know, interestingly, we talk about this in a negative sense in a very similar proverb, saying that the leopard cannot change its spots. The Asante proverb was probably more positive, essentially saying internally you are who you are, no matter how you sort of change yourself. It's not clear that it had the same negative connotation. The sawfish design is interesting to me. Sawfish are also very rare in the Asante region. I'm not sure if they can be found at all, but they're very common along the Niger River. And this is a symbol that we see used in places like Mali and Songhay. So it's very interesting to me that it makes its way down to Asante as a design as well, showing those regional connections, I think, and how important they were. So here's this Adinkra, Dwenemen, which is a masculine Adinkra in many ways, but indicating humility and strength. So there you see it as an Adinkra, and you also see it on the gold weight. So you can see sort of the intertextuality, if you will, between these different forms. I wanted to show this shield because we talk about military and how important this was as a sort of military commercial state. And many of these gold weights are military instruments. They're war horns, they're swords in some cases, they're jawbones, which are also associated with warfare. Here is a shield. It's a shield that looks like a chief's regalia, or the regalia of those who might accompany a chief. It's the frame of the shield. You don't see the leather covering, of course, but it's another really, I think, interesting example that shows part of what was considered valuable and important in Asante society at the time. But this is undoubtedly my favorite. Now, your students may know the game Wari or Mancala. It's called Wari in Ghana, and it's supposedly named after a particular Asante Hene, an Asante king, Apoku Wari, who was said to have been very wise. And he was said to have been wise, so wise that he could settle disputes between married couples. And the way he would do that is by having them sit down and play a game of Wari. And the game of Wari is only sort of about winning or losing, although with my Ghanaian auntie, it's always about winning or losing, and she always beats me. But in general, it's about playing and playing on and playing for a long time. This game, and often it's a game that's played between equals and friends of a long time, and they might play and just keep playing and play for a long time without worrying about who was going to win or not, at least in the 19th century. So I think that this particular gold weight is particularly significant in that way as well. And horses are really interesting because there were not many horses in Asante, in fact. Although in the north of Asante, they're very useful. In much of Asante, they die from the tryptosomiasis. I'm not an epidemiologist, but there's a sleeping sickness that infects them. And so some of these warriors, and Toby showed one earlier, are Asante, and some of them are actually based on warriors from those domains to the north that Asante was sometimes in conflict with. So again, they show this sort of martial or warlike ideal, but also there's a symbol of this sort of interaction with the area to the north that's so important. Here are thrones or stools. So again, a very important symbol of Henfo, of chiefs and rulers. You see one modern chair-looking one in the back. The others are a more traditional, if you will, style for being seated upon. These reflect then the great stool, the golden stool, which is a central figure in sort of Asante history and mythology, the central symbol. The golden stool, of course, was handed down to the first Asante Hene through his linguist / priest, religious figure. It remained the stool of the Asante Hene. When the British came to collect it, they started a war over it, and it was hidden. It was hidden away, and it's believed that when the British later requested it again, they were given a fake. And it's not actually clear precisely, although the royal court, of course, has a story that it was ever found again and recovered, or what's going on. But it remains the sort of central figure of the Asante kings and the Asante state. And so it's sort of both gold and a stool, and it combines then these sort of central ideas of statehood. And so these gold weights then are meant to sort of reproduce that stool and these kinds of stools that might be used by chiefs and kings and might be symbols of royalty. So again, these are some physical pieces of evidence that can help us to understand the symbols and ideas and what they reflected that were important in Asante society. And my argument is that students need the kind of background that Toby shared with you to understand and contextualize this state, but that they can then use these sources, as Toby said, these physical sources, these oral sources, to sort of drill in and pull out values and ideas of how this society was organized. So I'm going to stop there, and perhaps we have time for any last questions, should any more have emerged. Yeah, that's it.
No, great. Thank you, Trevor. So a few questions which are directed at a few people. The first one is from Miles, and this is for Tony. And he's interested, would only one family share a courtyard, or would several families share the same courtyard?
So, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, Tony, we can hear you.
Yeah. So it's one family, one extended family will share a courtyard.
Okay.
Really, yeah. So I mean, you could have, and then it depends on the wealth of the family. So you could have rooms opening onto several courtyards. So in cases where you have just one courtyard, maybe that is maybe a family that isn't really wealthy. But if it is wealthy, like in the case of the Asante Palace, they have several courtyards within the palace. Yes, mainly one extended family.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that. And this is from Kath. And she's writing a resource for nursery to year 3 about the Anansi stories. And she's really interested if, any resources that can tell her about the symbols and the images of the Kente cloth that people could point to. So I imagine there's some things in sources, but if there's anything else that you can recommend.
The only thing I'll say is that I mean the stories are the stories stand by themselves to some degree. The proverbs around Anansi are pretty incredible, right? Because there are a number as well, and I'm sorry that I didn't bring them up. But in Bumebe, there's a page of proverbs about Anansi that are interesting. Tony, I don't know about physical culture. Is Anansi represented in a dinkra or in cloth patterns or anything? I don't really think so.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
No.
Sorry.
Just for anyone who is not aware, the Anansi story is about the trickster. And I remember hearing them from a Jamaican standpoint, which shows the cultural transmission as well. And they were things that I loved hearing as a little kid about all the things that Anansi used to get up to and causing all kinds of trouble. Another question from Ebenezer, and this is to Trevor. Is it possible to differentiate Asante art and material culture from the general Akan material culture?
Well, and Tony in particular may want to weigh in on this as well. I mean, it is in certain ways. Well, there are certain symbols that are Asante symbols, right? That are the porcupine, for example, right? The porcupine is very much an Asante symbol. The golden stool, of course, and again, many artists would argue that Kente is an Asante thing that gets sort of taken up by everybody else later. But other than that, I mean, it is a very contiguous. I mean, there are these interesting differences. For example, on the coast, among the Fanti, for example, who are also Akan, you see a lot of these shrines that are run by brotherhoods, right? These Posuban shrines that are run by brotherhoods that very much have symbols of like being merchants and like how great it is to be a merchant, and these values that you would recognize as sort of Protestant work ethic values, like wake up on time and do these sorts of things that are not present that much in Asante society. There aren't these Posuban shrines. It's different. So it's a variation that you do get, I think. But there's also just this large continuity, I think, across the regions. Tony, what would you say?
I think what I would say is that I know that that there is I don't know. I mean, if it is a debate or controversy about the origin of the Kente cloth, where some people link it to the Volta region, the Ewe group of people. Some people think that it originated, Asante picked it up, and then made it big, like with other artwork of the Akan group. Asante would take it from Bonoman, so they make it big, and then we think that it originated with Asante people. But from an architectural point of view, I think that the broader Akan group seem to have the same architectural layout with that rectangular shape of housing. But maybe Kumasi, comparing Kumasi with with the Cape Coast, the Fante people, I think that houses in Kumasi seems to be bigger, elaborate than what we see in Cape Coast, because the effect of maybe Europeanization took really great shape in Cape Coast than compared to Asante. Until now, people cherish the extended family in Asante very well, so that when people are building, they're always thinking about the larger extended family. So if you build a house with 5 bedrooms, it wouldn't be enough to accommodate every member of the family. So they build huge, right? They try to build a huge sort of, not really mansions, but huge houses to accommodate a lot of people. So that could be from the architectural point of view, I think.
I mean, if I could just say one thing as well, it's interesting that the Fanti are thought to have migrated. I think the latest research is later in the 17th century from the central Kumasi region to the Cape Coast region. So I think it also speaks to the evolution of these crafts. Saying, you know, that these aren't static; they change according to the different influences which the different Akan peoples come into contact.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think so, right? So I would say more than looking at that there is similar and there's different. It's more that there's a sort of continuum of, you know, and so as these things split, people are carrying with them a sort of cultural core, but they split and then they come into contact with new environments and new people and sort of change things. But there is this long sort of Akan continuum, and you might even say that a lot of these values and a lot of the architecture, a lot of these ideas are, you know, not alien to the Ga or airway speakers or other local people as well, right? They transcend that sort of language barrier as well to some degree. So it's a really rich and messy mix. I agree with you entirely, Toby.
Okay, brilliant. We've got 3 minutes and we've got 3 questions. So there's one big question. But the first one is, as the symbolism of the Maroons, and this is from Otis, as the symbolism of the Maroons is so strong in Jamaica, is there much recognition of them in Ghana?
Yes, although mostly in Accra, I would say. You know, there's, you know, both Jamaicans and Brazilians moved back to Accra, but mostly to Accra and not to sort of the interior regions. And so there you find that kind of mix and that sort of thing. I don't know if it's very evident in Kumasi or Asante. Yeah,
I agree. Yeah, I think in Accra they call it the Tabum community. This is where they settled. Not in Kumasi.
Okay, brilliant. This is from Don. Did Asante women have an active role in leadership beyond figureheads of the clan, or
so
in terms of warfare and politics?
So let me say something very quickly and then let Tony. So yes, restricted in certain ways, but yes, but also what's important is that as women grew older, they could take on newer roles. For young women, especially, not so much. And women who were still menstruating were kept from a lot of roles. But once that stopped, you could suddenly take on more political roles. Correct, Tony?
Correct. Yeah. So I think the whole point was that if a family is in charge of, is the a chiefly or the royal family of a particular village, or maybe at the national level, the point is if you are a menstruating woman, you cannot assume any responsibility because you cannot have access to the storeroom and other sacred rooms when you are menstruating. So it can only. So in fact, menstruating women were actually barred from going to certain spaces in the palace and even in the extended family compound houses, because it believed that it was a menstruating woman or the blood was more like a filth, which wouldn't be accepted by the gods. So women were, unless you go beyond your menstruating cycle of.
Okay, brilliant.
The patriarchy is universal, I'm afraid.
Yeah. There's lots of other things. This is a big question. that I'm going to ask, and this is from Harriet. So, as historians, what kinds of questions do you think about when examining objects? Yeah, just, we've got a minute or so.
So Toby looks like he can take a lead here.
Well, I mean, I think, if you look at an object, my thought is it's speaking to me across however long, unmediated. It's an unmediated. So you have, that's the question I try to think is, what is unmediated in this, which is communicating, which I couldn't get from something else, because almost every other source we have is mediated in some way or other, and that's what's, I think, fascinating for me about objects.
I'll just say it's very tempting as a historian to just sort of, conduct a raid across borders into what the linguists do or what the archaeologists do, and just say, I want to just use this like a historian would use this piece. And it's really hard, because that's actually a little irresponsible, because the archaeologists have a lot to teach us, or the art historians or the linguists, about their particular areas. And so you really, really, really do have to kind of embrace the rules and understanding. So when I look at an object that's come across a lot of time, I do think a lot about what the archaeologists, whether they're digging archaeologists or other kinds of archaeologists, might tell me about how you have to know to some degree, as best you can, what the history of that artifact is across time. Why was it made? What would people at that time have seen it for? Why was it useful? How was it decorative? And then over time, how was it used, right? And knowing how these things are used turns out to be really, really important. And when you look closely at these things, you can often see evidence of how they were used. Tony's research is particularly interesting to me, because what happens eventually is the British come in, most of Kumasi is burnt down, it has to be rebuilt. And what Tony looks at that's so fascinating to me is the way in which the British and locals negotiate or get around each other on kind of how to do that. And so there's a whole history of colonialism based on what houses look like in Kumasi. And that's fascinating.
Brilliant. Tony, is there any more you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I basically, some of the questions that I ask whenever I look at objects is what Trevor has mentioned. So I don't want to, if there are more questions to be answered.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we're going to wrap up there. Thank you once again to Trevor, Toby, and Tony for giving up their time. For everyone else that's been listening. The next webinar, and this is something I know a lot of people are interested in, is on Benin, and it is on the 26th of May. We are hoping that we can, along with the usual panelists, that we can get a special guest as well. But please, we'll send some information around that. We'll also share the presentations and also some of the plans that we're hoping to get up and running before. Sorry, Toby.
Just quickly, Nick. Yeah, I think it might be worth saying about the website.
Yes,
because there were some questions about that. Yes, so we are going to revamp the African Kingdoms website with the material we've been producing over the last few weeks. But it will take a bit of time. Hopefully we'll be able to do it within the next, I would say, in the next 2 months, maybe something like that. So hopefully it should be ready for you to work on over the summer.
Yeah, brilliant. And, great. If you're making resources, please send them through. Some people have already done that, and we intend to put those on the website as well. So thank you very much, everybody. And we hope to see you again in a few weeks' time. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.